We turn now to a remarkable story of recovery and survival. Otto Grunfeld is in his early 70s. He's living in Oswald Kirk, well known in music circles in North Yorkshire after teaching at Ampleforth College and York University. He's also a counsellor, spending much of his time helping people through crisis and unhappiness in their lives. And that's what makes him so unusual, for Otto has experienced more of both of these than it is possible to imagine. As Czechoslovakian Jews growing up in Prague during the 1940s, he and his family became victims of the Nazi regime. His parents and his brother were all interned with him in concentration camps, and Otto was the only survivor. He came to write an account of the terrible things that he'd been through when training to be a counsellor. Others in the group he was in felt that he was holding things back. He realised that they were absolutely right, and writing this account of his ordeal has become the healing process which has finally led him to leave his past behind. Let's turn first to whether the writing of this book was a tremendously difficult thing to do.
Yes. It was like going through a dark cloud. And I dreaded going upstairs into my room to write. But I was determined, once started, I'll go on with it. And I literally didn't know what was going to come out. And the thoughts arranged themselves as I was writing. There was no plan, except that there's a sequence, which is natural because I try to be fairly accurate in the events as they followed each other.
And was there a lot that you'd put from your mind that perhaps you'd even forgotten?
Yes. A number of things suddenly popped up by through association, I suppose, which I had forgotten. And that went in like anything else. I felt everything has to go in and leave out nothing.
So what kind of a feeling did you have when you had finished? I mean, it must have been terribly painful to have to go through it all again, but did it leave you feeling better when you'd finished?
Yes. There's no doubt that progressively even I felt better. It wasn't obvious immediately, except to feel, thank God it's finished. I don't have to go up and write this. I've done it. And the effects of it came later, gradually and increasingly and surprisingly, because this is, although I thought it might have a therapeutic effect, what do we know of therapy to the extent of what does it precisely do? What it did was to release me in a way which nothing else had done.
Do you think there's a message for us all here that you know, when we are going through distress, and we all do after all at times, if we, I don't know whether it's write it down or articulate it or somehow kind of get it out of our brains on our own?
I'm sure of it. And I've repeatedly asked people who've come to me for help to, if they possibly could, and any old how, to write things down. But people don't like writing, on the whole.
So was this, the writing of this book, was this the kind of final healing, if you like? You've done so much already to heal yourself from these dreadful experiences, but was this what you needed to finally kind of cleanse yourself of it all in some way?
Yes, I would put in a proviso. I hadn't done much healing. I don't think I was fully aware right up to the time when I undertook this very intensive course what I really was and what I stood for. The awareness materialized during that time and afterwards. So the effects have lasted after that experience and after writing the book.
Let's go, if we may, back now to the wartime and talk about some of these experiences. I think the first question that anyone reading this book is going to ask is, why didn't your family leave? I mean, you presumably could have left. You were aware of the terrible threat of Nazism and what it might mean for the Jews. Why didn't you?
Well, my father, who was well off, had tried, and he found somebody who would have taken us across the border. I'm not sure why this wasn't followed up. Then somebody came to tell us that people had been released from transports, and there was a man who, on payment, would arrange a release from transportation. So that was undertaken, and all jewelry and foreign currency and valuables we had went to the man. I know that because I did the transporting. Blue-eyed and fair-haired, I could pack a bag and safely go to his place and deliver. And when all was delivered, we were put in a transport. And my parents were imprisoned. So it was a trap. So he had tried, my father had tried, but he had chosen the wrong man.
And when your parents were taken, did you have any idea at that stage of what that meant? Or did you firmly believe that you would see them again?
Well, I don't really know what I felt, except at first total despair. And then one lived on hopes. We'll see each other again when we are transported. We all knew we would go in transport. And shortly afterwards we were transported to Theresienstadt. But the parents were in the little fortress next door to it, which was run by the Gestapo. And we had absolutely no way of seeing them. And from there they were taken to my father to Mauthausen, my mother to Auschwitz, where they died. And because we had an aunt living in Prague, married to a German, the Aunt Edith in the book, we actually got a message to Theresienstadt to inform us that the parents had died. So we were in if you like, a fortunate position to know what happened and not expect, or to go through years and years of internment, hoping to see them and then come back and realizing they died. So we knew all the time.
Did people in your position realize what conditions were going to be like and the chances of you actually making it out alive being so slim? Did you actually have that knowledge? Or did that only happen when you were there?
It gradually transpired. But being young, I was 18, peak of my strength, I suppose. I felt it to be an adventure, which is almost crazy. And I must have filtered out a lot of information which I should have taken on board to realize this was deadly serious. But I didn't see it quite like that. And when we were in Theresienstadt, which was most of my internment, news came through, but garbled news of gas chambers and this, that and the other. And one chose to believe it or not. It hadn't happened there, so one hoped again.
It's an extraordinary word to use, an adventure.
Yes.
Particularly in retrospect. Can you explain that a bit more to me, why you felt it was an adventure?
Well, we lived a very sober, civilized, middle-class existence in Prague. All right, my father had been told that he couldn't go on working in the job he was so good at. And so we just lived in Prague. And the situation got worse and worse, but we lived a fairly comfortable life. We had to move a number of times, but even that wasn't so desperate. It wasn't a matter of life and death. When the transport started going, of course, we all became apprehensive. But youth is a wonderful thing. And I still felt excited and keen, for instance, to help packing people who had been put in transport and doing things necessary, whatever. And when our own time came, it didn't seem to worry me. It is quite amazing that one can take so much on and not think too far. And I believe this is the strength of young people, and I found that confirmed in Theresienstadt, which wasn't too bad, but where old people suffered terribly and died in large numbers. They just couldn't take it.
Tell me about your brother Paul, because you went through this terrible time when you arrived and you were sent into different queues, weren't you? Indeed, you address much of the chapter about that actually to him, don't you, as if you were talking to him?
Yes. At a given moment, I felt that I should start talking to him. And I didn't restrain myself. I didn't... because, fortunately, I thought not of a book. Had I thought of a reading public, I wouldn't have put it in. I would have kept it to myself. It would have been too private. So that I'm letting out something that is intensely private, and I felt all the things that needed saying, I could now tell him. And it just so happened.
So how did it come about that you actually got separated and you got sent into these two different queues, which were so crucial?
It's a well-known phenomenon of those times. There were transports and transports arriving in Auschwitz. We were just one of many. And arriving in the middle of the night. And we were thrown out of these kettle trucks. And screamed and shouted at by the capos, who were the people with armbands to signify that they had to function. And they were quite ruthless. And there were beatings and there were kickings and all the luggage was left. We lost everything. And we were queuing up, and the queue progressed very slowly eventually. It seemed to take hours. I can't recall how long it took. Eventually arriving at a table with an SS man sitting and casually looking up and asking one or two questions. And then pointing with his arm, pointing one way or another. And my brother, who is very athletic, much more so than I, happened to have his glasses on and had dark hair and brown eyes. And I was blonde and blue-eyed. And that did it. So he pointed me one way and my brother the other. My brother, being, as usual, in front of me, marched on where he was told. And when I finished, which took 3-4 seconds of this questioning, he may have motioned something, but I simply followed Paul. And he screamed after me to go the other way. And that was that.
Did you know what that meant at that stage?
Not an idea. It came later. It may have been the following day when somebody asked me, where's Paul? One of my friends, a former teacher, in fact. And I said, well, we were separated. So he was wild-eyed. He was in a terrible state because he was separated from his wife, who used to be my piano teacher. And he said, "Do you know what that means?" I said, "No." "Do you see these chimneys smoking?" "Yes." "Do you know what that means?" I said, "No." And so then all this was revealed.
And you had this terrible thing that happened to you when you were back in Prague again. Somebody said that they thought your brother was still alive, didn't they?
Yes.
And you had all that hope restored to you again.
Because this hope, again, despite all that, being told what it means, I put it away. I wasn't going to accept that. So somewhere deep down, in a secret place, I kept the hope that he was alive. I knew my parents weren't. And so when this was said, I thought, at last. And it's true. And within a very short time, it was confirmed it was another Paul.
You write very vividly about the terrible physical torment that you had to go through, the cold. I think that came through extremely strongly, and obviously the terrible hunger and the hard work. What was it about you, do you think, that got you through that when so many others didn't make it?
One factor, I mean, there are a number of factors in any situation. Certainly, the most powerful factor was I had friends. There were 4 of us, and we had known each other, 3 certainly, for many years. And they were good friends. So to be among a number of friends was just amazing, the strength that we received from that. The other thing is that I actually believed in work. When I was told to do something, I I wasn't going to sabotage it. Because I felt if I sabotage it, I'm sabotaging myself and my self-esteem. No, I shouldn't say that, because it wasn't quite so obvious to me. It happened spontaneously. I wasn't going to stand and watch for the guard when he turns around to stop working, and when he looks at me, that suddenly be busy with my shovel or pickaxe, which was the usual tool we had. I just worked on.
And you describe working very hard. You describe the people who'd given up, who more or less were just kind of saying a few prayers and were so weak they were doing nothing. Yes. But you were, and yet you must have been so hungry. Where did you find that strength from?
I think we have much, much greater strength than we ever appreciate and realize. And we only use tiny quantities. And the amount of labor that went into this work there, and the pathetic amount of food we received.
Which was what? What did you get?
A slice of bread, brown bread, in the morning, and very often nothing during the whole day. When we were fortunate, we might be given cabbage water lunchtime, but literally cabbage water. But that was a blessing. And on return, we would receive a bowl of thickish soup. And that was it.
What did your internment do to you physically?
I was totally debilitated. I could barely stand up. I suppose I was just skin and bones. I couldn't eat. I used to get fits of suffocation on eating even the tiniest amounts. So that when I suddenly had all the quantities of food I cared for, when we were freed, and the Americans provided plenty, I couldn't eat it. I could only eat tiny little bits.
You talk about people dying because they tried to eat too much.
That was, it was unsuitable stuff they produced. They thought, well, fatten them up, I suppose. I could imagine the Major Colonel or whoever he was, they fatten up that lot, otherwise they'll die on us. And there were thousands around. So that was, of course, a recipe for disaster, because people got diarrhea and died. They simply didn't have the stamina at that stage to take that. They died of typhoid. I remember carrying, or helping to carry, was more or less leaning to start with until I packed it in. I just couldn't do any more. But typhoid broke out. We were even bombarded in the last camp by flak. No, not flak, American guns. There was a gun in the camp shooting at the American army. So, of course, they replied not knowing what they were shooting at, and they were shooting at us as well. So there were casualties there. There was typhoid. There was this terrible conditions of literally 99.9% of people were in a dreadful condition.
Did you believe that you were going to survive?
Well, for one reason or another, that was a question which I didn't allow myself to put. When something good happened, like when I was on a Sunday, we weren't always working. I was in the wash house, and I suddenly heard airplanes, and I heard the flag shooting, and I saw Allied attack on. We were quite close to Augsburg and Munich, and I saw the planes. That was marvelous. I suddenly felt, well, it's possible. We'll get out of this. But then we returned to normal and just carried on, doggedly carried on. And one carried on and carried on until one dropped. The moment anyone dropped, that was it. They were put away. They were loaded up into lorries. They were put in an infirmary. And then a few days later, lorries would arrive and pick them up and take them away, and that was that.
So you knew if you dropped, that probably meant death anyway?
Yes. So one didn't think about a thing like this, because fear, unnecessary fear, is very debilitating.
As obviously you did get out, and you did go home, and you had to start to rebuild your life.
Yes.
And yet, in many ways, that was when so much of your difficulties really started, wasn't it?
Yes.
Can you describe how you felt at that time? Let's say, I don't know, a couple of years after the end of the war, something
Well,
like that.
immediately after the war, I came to a Prague which was in a state of confusion. And I tried to retrieve things which we had given for people to keep for us if we returned. And I could hardly get anything back. Most of our valuable stuff, if not all, was simply not returned. So I was very, very disillusioned. I found it very hard. Then I was conscripted in the army. I found that appalling thing to do. Instead of telling me, well, you are exempt, I was in no condition to become a soldier. That was another shock. And generally I felt I had lost touch with the country. It was a reaction. I don't feel like this now, but I felt then like that. So when I had the opportunity to go away, and I believe I describe it in the book, I didn't care where I went. And I chose England just because I suppose I liked the sound of the name.
How do you, after being through something where you have seen humanity at its very, very worst, how do you begin to trust people and to form relationships?
Because even at worst, there were always some good souls around. There were better and worse people among the guards, among the soldiery. So making gross generalizations, one errs, I think, heavily, and one condemns people one has no right to condemn.
And could you still see goodness in life and goodness in people?
So I could see that. They didn't always have the opportunity to exercise their goodness because they couldn't take the risk. Anybody's life depended on being discreet. The moment you were indiscreet and somebody reported you, well, that was that. And in Germany that meant a soldier would be sent to the east. And they all knew what that meant. Everybody was frightened.
And how did you begin to sort of rebuild your life? I mean, you had your music, didn't you?
Yes.
Which I think was a tremendous comfort to you.
That is an amazing thing because it takes you right out of everything into a totally different world. And thinking about it today, in fact, I suddenly realized, well, the great things in art have to do with love. That somebody, it's not simply an outpouring of huge, big genius. It's an outpouring of love into something, into a medium, whether it is art, paint, color, sculpture, music, whatever. But it's an outpouring of that. So when you are in touch with it, you are being healed through some kind of love. And provided one doesn't get too frustrated and take it easy and doesn't expect too much of oneself, it works wonders. So that has helped me. It's also so many people were extraordinarily kind. That is an amazing, amazing thing. Not just kindness, more perhaps acceptance. That people were prepared to take me on as I was.
And you married, and you've had a long and, it would seem, very happy marriage.
Yes.
From what you say in the book.
That's right.
And again, does an experience like that not damage you so much that it's very difficult to give in a relationship?
You are absolutely right. And I suppose my wife would have a few things to say about that one. That it's not all rosy. One doesn't come cleansed and purified through an experience like this. One comes out in many ways rather mucked up. And one has to gradually rebuild oneself. And one of the important things one has to rebuild is one's self-esteem. Because until that comes into being, there's not much to give. And so all this takes time, and it takes so many years. And the thing I feel that is not being realized when we send counselors quickly to people traumatized, yes, it's a good thing, it is a help, but it takes years and years for things to gradually begin to heal.
And yet, obviously, you have healed. I mean, you are obviously having and have had very fulfilling times in life. It's quite obvious from the book that you haven't let all this impede your life.
Yes, possibly because I don't believe in hatred. What I feel stops people in their tracks to healing and fulfillment is their enormous hatred and resentment of what had happened, and how deeply they associate with it, and how they almost cling to it. I find it a great danger. And it may well be that, I hate to theorize on this, people always ask me, why don't you feel anything against the Germans? Don't you hate them? I said, I don't. And I was perfectly honest. Now and again, something happens and the goal rises for a little while. And it subsides again because, things happen all over the world. So what? And one cannot go back forever, bringing this back to life, which what hatred and resentment does. It brings these events right back here again, makes them real almost. And then one starts all over again, suffering and becoming the victim. And I think I've avoided it.
If you'd like to read Otto's book, it's called The Survivor's Path by Otto Grunfeld. You can get it from Waterstones in York, apparently. It's published by Aislabie. Now, they are publishers abroad, so you may find it difficult to track them down. If you have any difficulty getting the book, ring us at Radio York and we can help you further. Radio York.